Well, good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to this edition of the Cyber Showcase. I'm Brett Rock, your host. I'm a business development and product specialist here at SBS Cybersecurity. I stumbled over that because I just got a new title. Turns out I didn't manage anybody, so I didn't need manager in my title. But anyway, I got through that. This is taking the terror out of incident response. So our focus today, as you probably read in the description and as the title kind of indicates, is going to be discussing an incident response program in general, and then talking a little bit about some of the ways we can help with it and things like that. We recognize incident response is not one of those fun things to do, but it is important for a variety of reasons. First of all, it's required. Certainly, there's lots of guidance out there for anybody on the call who's a financial institution, so you have to do it. The FTC safeguards rule is in place and requires it for non-bank FIs. And then the FTC even has some guidance around it as well for publicly traded companies. So it's just something we have to do. It's also important because focusing on prevention isn't enough. Just planning and saying, okay, we know we're going to be able to stop something doesn't alleviate the pressure of what if something does happen. We can't be perfect, and things are changing on a rapid basis. So just focusing on prevention isn't enough. And then it's just in the best interest of the organization. Having a good incident response plan in place helps you contain damage, lessen downstream effects, and then kind of most importantly, really helps with reputational risk and things like that as well. So lots of great reasons we need to be doing this, even though it's probably not the most fun thing you're going to have to do. Now, I will say, and anybody who's got small children in the audience will be able to relate to this, hopefully. I did get a pretty good cold from one of my children who came home from school this past week. So if you hear me mute out for a second, I'm going to try not to cough in everybody's ear too much. But my goal, or one of the big goals here, is to get through this without dying / having a coughing fit. The other goals for today are pretty simple. We want to talk about the core components of an incident response plan, kind of in general. Just to be completely transparent, there are plenty of people at our organization that are much smarter than I am that can talk about each individual piece in great detail. I'm going to lay out some of the resources we've got that we can provide. There's also all kinds of other webinars that we've done to cover this subject as well. I think this will give anybody who's relatively new to incident response or doesn't have their arms wrapped around it entirely, we should be able to give you some really good information today. But again, there's plenty of other information out there. And then we are going to introduce some of the different ways that we can assist you, including rolling out our newest offering, which is our JumpStart Retainer that we are partnering with Arctic Wolf on. So with that said, let's go ahead and jump into things. This is our agenda for today. Actually, that's my contact information, as well as me dressed up as the Headless Horseman for a Halloween a few years ago. We take Halloween pretty seriously in this house. The agenda, introductions, we're working on that. We do have some housekeeping up front. I'm going to talk a little bit about who we are as a company for those of you who are not familiar. We're going to talk about what incident response is, some scary statistics that are out there. What are the components of a good IRP? That's kind of the most useful part, I would think, for you, at least in terms of the information. How do we use it when we need it? We're going to introduce the Incident Response JumpStart Retainer. And then if we have some time at the end, we'll do some questions and answers as well. Speaking of that, if you do have questions, I am going to ask that you use the GoToMeeting box that has been provided. I will be happy to answer those to the absolute best of my ability. However, there is the chance that I may need to go back and get some additional information for you. So just kind of keep that in mind. All right, just from a housekeeping perspective, this is Cybersecurity Awareness Month. So hopefully everybody's doing a great job with that already. If not, we do have a ton of free resources available on our website. In fact, for the first time since I started to do this, remembered to link the handouts. If you go into that, you download those handouts in the GoToMeeting option there. All of this is hyperlinked. So if you want to go and download our security awareness toolkit, there's some great information in there. We also have a ton of other resources available as well. A couple of the other webinars that we've got coming up that I would encourage you to take a look at, both because they mainly align with what we're going to discuss today. Dylan Krutzfeld is going to be talking about defending your business against business email compromise. You're going to hear me talk about that a little bit later on in terms of a big threat from an incident response perspective. So that's a webinar we've got coming up. And then Will Keller on our team is going to be talking about assumed breach testing. So why you should test as if a hacker is already in your network. Those are excellent webinars we've got. We're really excited about them. And I would encourage you to take a look at both of them. And again, the register link there is hyperlinked if you're interested. All right, for those of you who are not familiar with SBS, just quickly, we have been in the industry for 19 years now. We're looking forward to celebrating the big 2-0 next year. And what I think is most important about that is this is what we do. We're not an accounting firm that decided we could do IT audits, or a managed service provider that said, hey, let us do your network security work. We eat, breathe, sleep, drink network information and cybersecurity. So not knocking any of those other companies, but we feel it's important that that's who we are and what we do. Consulting, auditing, network security testing, education, and then products and services is really who we are and what we do. We've got more than 1,400 organizations using our track tool in over 40 states. In fact, we have customers in 49 states currently. So if anybody on the call knows somebody in Idaho that needs work, let us know. We're endorsed across the country by a number of state banking associations. We've got a ton of educational offerings that I'm sure you're all familiar with, including our excellent Hacker Hour. And then we do have a top tier of highly qualified experts that help with all of our offerings and services. So all that to say, we feel very strongly we are the most trusted name in information and cybersecurity in the industry. We really focus a lot on, and this is going to play into today's conversation a lot, is the idea of taking a proactive approach to information and cybersecurity. We absolutely want to make sure you're compliant. We want to help you do that. We want to make sure that you're meeting all the necessary guidance that's out there, but we do want to take it a step further and help you really get value out of that program as well. And we think the incident response program is a great example of that, right? It's one thing to just have one to say we have one, but if it's not tested and if we're not confident in it and we haven't looked through it or really planned in advance for different scenarios and things like that, if we just have it for the sake of having it, that's not very helpful, right? That's a really reactive approach, and that can get us in trouble. So what we encourage is a very proactive approach to risk management. The idea of doing this stuff, not just for the sake of doing it, but because we can actually get value out of it as well. And again, we have lots of different ways we can help you do that. We're not necessarily suggesting you have to put in a ton more effort. It's just, we want to do something that you can get more value out of as well. All right. So with that said, let's talk more specifically about incident response. So, for anybody who's not familiar with that term, I went to NIST and pulled it up, and the definition there I thought was okay: the mitigation of violations of security policies and recommended practices. So that's their definition. I went to ChatGPT. I said, hey, you tell me what incident response is, and that refers to the process and set of procedures an organization follows to manage and mitigate security incidents, disruptions, or emergencies effectively, which I thought was pretty effective, pretty good explanation there. But thinking about it and saying, okay, well, it's October, we're doing this kind of Halloween themed, horror themed session today. I asked ChatGPT, as Count Dracula, tell me what incident response is. Now, I'm not personally going to read this to you in the voice of Count Dracula, but I almost guarantee everybody in your head is doing it. But you can kind of see what it says there. So just to have a little bit of fun with it, I think that's the most fun of the three definitions. All right, so one thing that does come up sometimes is, what is the difference between, we hear a lot about business continuity, we hear a lot about disaster recovery and incident response. So let's just kind of talk about what those three are and kind of how they fit together. Because really the umbrella is business continuity. It's how we continue to operate regardless of the type of disruption, right? So how are we planning? How are we preparing for whatever might happen so that we can continue to operate? But disaster recovery and incident response are just components of that, and they kind of work on different wavelengths. Disaster recovery is going to focus on emergencies with more of an emphasis on protecting human life in affected communities. So think about it in terms of more of a natural disaster perspective, right? Whereas incident response is going to focus on security incidents with more of an emphasis on safeguarding an organization's digital assets. Now, that's not to say there's not overlap there, right? Ransomware is an incident. We're going to treat it as something that we have to focus. It's a security incident with an emphasis on our digital assets. But it also means that we might be down. We might have some downtime, right? If we have to get to our backups, or we don't have good backups, or whatever the case may be, there's a disaster recovery component there as well. So while these things are separate under the umbrella of business continuity, they do have some overlap there as well. So hopefully that kind of breaks that out a little bit and separates it and makes it a little bit more clear. All right, now NIST, when it comes to information and kind of the incident response, has these 5 different pieces. And I'm sure you're familiar with these, but the idea of identify, protect, detect, respond, and recover. On the identify side, it's where we're talking about, thinking about our assets and what our risk management strategy looks like and our policies and our procedures and things like that. Protection is the controls. How are we protecting ourselves up front? Detect is where we kind of start thinking about, okay, if something is happening, how would we be able to make sure that we know it's occurring? Responding is making sure that we are prepared to deal with whatever's occurring. And then recovery is getting back to our state of normal, whatever that might look like. And so NIST has this, they lay it out really clearly. We also have what we consider to be kind of the modern incident response life cycle. Now, you're looking at this and you probably said the same thing I did when I first saw it. That doesn't really look like a cycle. Totally agree. But let's just go through it really quickly. And it kind of does tie back to that NIST framework or that flow that we just talked about. Prepare is where we're going to talk about that protect, right? So what controls do we have in place ahead of time to make sure that if something were to occur, we're in as good a position as possible to defend against it. When we move into the detect and identify stage, that's where it's that piece on the workflow. So if we go back, that's the protect and detect kind of, or the detect and identify piece. So that's the observe, orient, decide, and act. So what's going on? How are we prepared to deal with it? That may also move us into the contain stage where we are containing whatever is occurring, and then it moves into the eradicate where we're degrading, deceiving, or destroying whatever is occurring. So whatever the threat is that has occurred, we want to contain it, and then we do want to eradicate it so that eventually we can move into that recovery phase. So that's that kind of recovery from the NIST piece of things, returning to a state of normal. All of that leads to a lessons learned, which is a postmortem. We are going to look at it, we're going to sit down, we've gone through this, whether it's a test, which we'll talk more about later on, about testing our program, or it's a real life incident that we're addressing. We do want to have a lesson learned session so we can sit down and understand how it went, how well we responded, and were we able to detect what happened, how quickly could we contain and eradicate it, and what did recovery look like? Whatever lessons learned we have, we move back into the prepare phase. It's a constant feedback loop, and it's right there at the bottom saying that. So I'm not coming up with that on my own here. We understand what happened, we get our lessons learned, and we move that back into the prepare phase. Digital forensics in the upper right-hand corner is something that we can use kind of throughout the process as necessary, right? So if we need to bring in a third party or a digital forensics firm to help with the detection and identification, to help with the containment, and then certainly eradicate and lessons learned as well. That does fit in kind of multiple different pieces of the cycle, if you will. But again, all of this kind of fits back into that flow that we talked to with NIST. We're going to prepare, detect and identify, contain, eradicate, recover, and then have that lessons learned piece of things. There are really two big questions that you should think about when it comes to incident response. So the first one is, how would I know if someone were in my network? So thinking about it in terms of the old horror cliche, we trace the call, it's coming from inside the network. If somebody were in my network, how would I know? That's one big question. The second one you have to be able to answer is, if someone were sending information out the back door, could I tell? So how do I know if somebody's in there? And then if they were extracting information, how could I tell? If you can't answer, if you can't answer yes to both of those questions, you probably have some work to do on your incident response program. So not to say that if you answer yes to both of them, you're good to go. There's probably ways you can improve as well. But certainly, if you talk about both of those questions, how could I tell if somebody were in my network? And how could I tell if somebody were taking information out of my network? If you don't have an answer of yes, or how you would handle both of those, it's probably a sign that you need to do some work. All right, there's all kinds of scary stats. If you've been on any of my cyber showcases before, I talk about how much I love statistics. Some of these are probably ones you've heard from me before. A cyber attack occurs every 39 seconds. So again, by the end of today, there's going to have been a ton of them that have happened. Recovering from ransomware costs a business on average about $1.85 million. 95% of cybersecurity breaches are caused by human error. So phishing being the most common attack vector. US banks lose about $4.36 for every lost fraud dollar. So while the impact on a victim is pretty big, it's also bigger on the institution in a lot of cases. There are 3.4 billion phishing emails that are sent every single day. 560,000 new pieces of malware are detected daily. The average ransomware recovery timeframe is now 22 days. Again, some cases it's shorter, some cases it's longer, but the average is at 22 days. And then a minute of downtime can cost as much as $9,000. So 1 minute costing almost 10 grand out the door potentially. So again, there's all kinds of scary stats that are out there that you can find that tell us why this is important, why we should have a plan, right? If it goes back to the kind of the definite or the description that I gave in when I sent out the information about this webinar, when we watch a horror movie and we think about all the dumb things people are doing, right? They think the bad guy's dead, so they just kind of chill out and relax next to the body, or they see a haunted house or an abandoned house and they go in and they start looking around, or they split up. All the different dumb things that we see, all the horror movie tropes. A lot of it comes down to just kind of figuring things out on the fly, where having a plan of attack can certainly make sure that we're better equipped rather to handle those sorts of things. And the same thing goes for incident response as well. All right, so what are the core components of a good incident response program? And I want to be upfront. This is not necessarily a comprehensive list of things that should be in your incident response program. This is just kind of what the core components of a good one should have. There may be some others that we can talk about as well, but just kind of going through them quickly, and we're going to dig into each one in pretty good detail here. Incident type definitions. So, what are the definitions of the different incidents that might occur? We want to have an incident threat assessment. We'll dig more into that. An incident response team, who the members are, what their roles and responsibilities are, all laid out for us. We also want to have information about, again, the roles and responsibilities they have, but also the approval for them to do the things that they're going to do. We want to have incident escalation procedures. So how do we know, when we see an incident, how do we know how bad it is? And thus, how are we going to escalate it? What does escalation look like? That's kind of the tree of, if something were to happen, what do we do from there? We want to have an incident response playbook. And you're actually going to have probably more than one of those. You're going to have a playbook for basically any type of incident that might occur. And we'll talk more about that as well. Procedures for inappropriate usage. So, it's anything that might violate your acceptable use agreements, your definitions of personally identifiable information, procedures for customer notification, contact information, testing requirements, and then finally, and we think this is really important, integration with business continuity and vendor management. Now, the reason that integration is important is, as we talked about earlier, some incidents are going to have a business continuity impact, right? So just because this is in our incident response plan doesn't mean that we might not have downtime because of it. So we need to have some integration there. We need to integrate with our vendor management because a lot of the stuff we're doing nowadays is outsourced to vendors. So we need to be aware of who we need to work with and what do our vendors look like. We may need to address some sort of incident that happened because of our vendor. So we need to have that integration as well. So these are the components. And again, we're going to get into each of them here in just a second. So let's start with the types of incidents that we might face. Now, if you have a good IT risk assessment, if you have a good audit, if you have findings and recommendations and things like that, you can use those to build out these incidents. You can also use threat intelligence. So if you are, on FSISAC and you're listening, you're understanding about threats that are out there, or you go to the SBS blog, or any of the other ways that you might gather that threat intelligence that can drive what types of incidents you want to think about here. But you're going to start kind of with your general IT incidents. So, DDoS attacks, business email compromise, ransomware. Those last two in particular are probably two that you want to address in your incident response playbook that we'll talk about in a moment. Service provider incidents. So, what happens if it happens in our core or our internet banking or our credit and debit card processor? And then physical theft or loss. So it's not always going to be something where they're hacking into our network or somebody fell for a phishing email or something like that. It might be, I parked at the gym, I left my computer bag in there, and I went up with the car unlocked, and somebody grabbed my laptop, or somebody grabbed a USB drive off the sidewalk that was labeled tax return information and tried to open it, or something like that. It might even be paper. It might even be I threw some information away and somebody went dumpster diving and grabbed it. So there's all kinds of incident types that are out there. You're going to want to think about the ones that might be most critical to you and include those and kind of definitions of those in your program or in your plan. An incident threat assessment. So pretty simple. What incidents are most likely to affect your institution, and how can you identify them? So the easiest way to do this, again, is if you have a good IT risk assessment or you have good audit findings and things like that, that's where that stuff can come into play. So what threats do we need to be most worried about? What would have the greatest impact? What would be the most likely to occur? Those are pieces of a good IT risk assessment, so we might want to consider that. Also, that threat intelligence piece. So whether it's some sort of artificial intelligence threat assessment that you're doing, or whether it's just going out and getting threat intelligence from a variety of Google searches, or again, the FSISAC or anything like that. Those are areas where you can kind of think about what threats are out there, which ones are we most concerned about, and how are we going to be able to identify them. You need to have your incident response team laid out. Now, I also asked Count Dracula to help us with that as well. So the incident response team is a group of individuals who come together to protect the sanctity of their organization. They are guardians of data and the keepers of cybersecurity, ensuring that the organization remains safe from dark forces. So again, I didn't read it like that, but you probably did in your head. Your incident response team members should absolutely include your information security officer. So they're kind of the leader of the team, right? They're going to be the one that's probably going to be most involved in the whole thing. You also want to have other members of senior management, and not just IT related. And that's kind of important. It's easy to think, oh, we want to have an incident response team, so we're going to put everybody that's familiar with IT in it. You certainly would want to include people that have that background, but more than anything, you want to include people that have you've identified as having a purpose, of having a role to play when it comes to information and cybersecurity. So it does not just have to be IT. In fact, it probably is helpful if you branch out into other areas of the institution or organization. And then finally, you do want to have a designated media contact. So that's a good example of somebody who probably isn't going to be all that familiar with IT, but we do want to have somebody that can be that point of contact if we do need to notify people, whether it's the media, whether it's individuals, customers, whatever the case may be. So the important thing here is they have to be identified, and you have to give them roles and responsibilities. And we'll talk more about that in just a second. But the other thing is you want to have it in writing as part of your plan, what they're going to be able to do, and that they have the approval to do it. Because that we don't want to have to worry about after the fact, were we supposed to do that, or whatever the case may be. The roles and responsibilities, the information security officer, again, they have the biggest number of things on their plate. They're going to receive the incident notifications. So if something happens, they are going to be the person that gets notified. They will report the incident to appropriate management. That's going to be those escalation procedures we'll talk about. Convene the IR team as required. So if something does rise to the level of we need to get the team together, they would be in charge of doing that. They're going to lead the incident identification procedures. They're going to lead or delegate both incident handling, but also the customer notification procedures as well. So how are we, in what cases are we going to notify customers, and how are we going to do that? They're going to designate the IR team member to communicate with the media as necessary. That always reminds me, if you're an Office fan, there was an episode where they had an inappropriate watermark on the paper that went out, and Dwight Schrute was put in charge and did not handle it particularly well. So again, you want to be careful with who you put in charge of that process. You're going to compile follow-up reports for the IT committee and the board, and then conduct the lessons learned meeting. So again, the ISO is going to be the leader of the incident response team. And again, I say ISO, that could be anybody that you have in that kind of role, whether it's a chief information security officer or ITO or whatever the case may be. The incident response team member is going to be responsible for reporting incidents to the ISO. They will assist in both incident identification and incident handling procedures as necessary, as well as that customer notification procedure. And then they will be responsible for helping notify staff of the incident and the outcome of the response to that particular incident. So again, picking people that are in a position that have the skills to be able to handle the things that you're going to need from them. You also want to include your IT committee as well, because they're going to be there to make sure they're reviewing the follow-up reports. They're going to be there to integrate lessons learned into both the information security program overall, but also our incident response plan. So if there are lessons learned, if there's something that comes up that we need to be better, whether it's a test or an actual incident, we want to make sure that we're updating both our information security program, but also our incident response plan as well. And then they will also inform the board of directors of any changes to both the ISP and the IRP following an incident as well. The board of directors, pretty simple. They're going to review the follow-up reports, and then they need to review any changes to the incident response plan, and I didn't include it in here, but also the information security program as well. So again, lots of different people are probably going to be involved in this. You want to kind of make sure that you have the right people in the right places with the right responsibilities, but it all does kind of flow upward to the board, where at the end of the day, they are responsible. So they're going to review the follow-up reports and then any changes that need to be made. So you do, in your incident response plan, want to have all of this laid out. So again, you're not figuring it out on the fly. Who's responsible for what? How are we going to handle this? You want to have incident escalation procedures. Now, this is that tree that we talked about, kind of the, if this happens, we do this. So you want to understand the risk of an incident and the effect it can have on your organization. And then how are we going to handle that once it happens? So we kind of have some examples here on the screen here. If you take a look on the left-hand side, we talk about the severity level. So from no effect on any systems all the way up to critical, we're going to look at this and say, okay, well, if something happens, let's say it's a minimal impact on a few systems or one to a few systems. Well, that means the technical support and assessment team, they would be the ones that get involved, and then it would be normal operations, IT department monitoring for alerts and things like that. If it's a high description of severity, and you lay out exactly what that looks like to you, this is who gets involved. That's when we activate the incident response team. We're going to bring in technical support. We might have our communications team involved, and the threat has spread beyond short-term containment and things like that. So the idea behind this, and you don't have to copy exactly what we're doing here, obviously, but you want to have an idea of if the severity level of the incident is X, this is what we're going to do. So it just kind of lay it out as descriptively, or I don't even think that's a word, but as describe it as carefully as possible. So again, you're not figuring this stuff out on the fly. You have a plan for it. You can say, okay, this happened. This is how we're going to handle it. You want to have an incident response playbook. Now, this is going to be, we're going to dig into this as well. This could have been its own kind of separate section, but the incident response playbook is a step-by-step walkthrough for the most probable and impactful cyber threats to your organization. So once we identify what those threats are, and in this case, just let's think about the ones that are probably the most common: business email compromise, ransomware. Those are two that we would put pretty high on any list. How are we going to handle those? What is the step-by-step process we are going to follow for going through that? Now, that brings into play what we call the cyber kill chain. Now, you guys may be familiar with this. This was created by Lockheed Martin. But the idea is this is the workflow that a bad guy will follow. They'll start with recon, right? They start by thinking about, understanding the institution, the organization, learning about them, finding weaknesses and things like that. They weaponize, they deliver, there's the delivery, the exploitation, any installation, command and control of the network, and then finally exfiltration, so getting information out. The idea behind the cyber kill chain, and we have a great article about this that I've hyperlinked in the resources section that I'll talk about in just a little bit. But the idea behind the cyber kill chain is we have controls at every single level of this kill chain where we might be able to mitigate the threat. We're going to start with an incident. That's probably going to kick off our incident response. What we're trying to avoid is an actual breach. So the idea is, if there is an incident, where can we stop it? How can we stop it? And the idea behind kind of a playbook and kind of having that mentality is looking at the cyber kill chain, for instance, and saying, in each of these different steps, what controls do we have in place to mitigate the threat? And are there any gaps that we can fill in? And this is just kind of an example that we put together for ransomware. So on the left-hand side of the screen, you're going to see the pieces of the kill chain. So recon, weaponization, delivery, exploitation, and lateral movement. And then across the top, we've got those, the detect, deny, disrupt, degrade, deceive, and contain. So at every step in the kill chain, how are we going to handle that from a detection standpoint? How are we going to handle it from a denying standpoint? Do we have an ability to disrupt or degrade or deceive? How would we contain it? And this, by laying it out like this and kind of really digging into it in this level of detail, you can look at it and say, okay, where are our gaps? Are there areas that we can plug in some additional controls? Is there a way to disrupt the weaponization of a particular threat? So again, this is just an example, and if you grab the slide deck, you can see this as well. But the idea of taking that cyber kill chain and putting it into a plan to say, okay, at every step in this process, how can we mitigate the threat? How can we stop it from becoming a breach or something like that? So the pieces of an IR playbook, which again is actually it's like a Russian nesting doll. It's inside of your incident response plan. The pieces are pretty simple. You've got a threat assessment. So you're going to look at what are the threats that are out there, which ones are most, which are the worst and which are most likely. Again, you've already got something like that. We talked about it a little bit already. What are the attack vectors? So how could we be attacked? If there were ransomware, if that's what we're dealing with, what does that threat look like? What are the tactics that they would use to deliver that? And the important thing about attack vectors is this changes all the time, right? That's something, one of the takeaways we're going to talk about at the end here is the incident response plan isn't something that's just okay, I did it, stick it on a shelf, we'll look at it again a year from now. This is something that has to be updated pretty frequently because all of this is changing pretty quickly. So we take a particular threat, we look at the attack vectors. How could that threat potentially be enacted on us? We create IR scenarios. So we take the threat and we create a scenario in which it occurred. So if the threat is ransomware, we might say an employee gets an intriguing email, they click on a link in an email, and from that, ransomware gets installed on the network. That's the scenario. So we take the threat, we build a scenario off of it. We perform a tabletop walkthrough. Now, most of you have heard of a tabletop test. That's what you're most familiar with. We will do that. But what we're doing here is what we call a walkthrough, which is kind of like a rehearsal for the test. This is where we sit down with probably a smaller team. And it could even just be the ISO, for instance, sitting down and going through it. But you might want to include the incident response team as well. But it's a smaller group of people. We sit down, we kind of go through the scenario and we talk about it and we figure out, does this make sense? Is this something that we can test on? So again, the tabletop walkthrough might not be the most critical step and you might want to skip it, but it is something that can be important because it allows us then to modify those scenarios. So if we go through the walkthrough and we realize that the scenario doesn't make sense or it's not up to date or we've used the same one already or something like that, then we can update it, right? So we do the walkthrough, kind of the rehearsal, so that allows us to modify those scenarios. And then finally, we do that tabletop, well, not finally, but we do the tabletop testing next. So that's the role playing. And I know everybody loves role playing, right? This is where we all get in a room, and not just the ISO, not just the incident response team, but we bring in other stakeholders as necessary, kind of a more the merrier sort of situation. Really depends on the scenario who you need to bring in, obviously. But we're going to take the scenario we've created and we're actually going to role play with it, right? So an employee clicks on a link in an email, ransomware gets installed on the network. How do we handle it from there? What are we going to do once that's happened? How do we address it? Once we're done with the testing, we review our incident response plan, which basically means we incorporate any lessons learned. So as we're doing the tabletop testing and as we finish it, we're going to document things like, who was involved in the testing. We're going to document what the scenario was. We're going to document the things we thought we did well. We're going to document the things that we thought we need to improve on or where the gaps are. And then we're also going to document any questions that need to still be answered. So we do the tabletop testing, we do the role playing, we all have fun, we document all those important things, and then we take that and we update our incident response plan. So the idea is you have an IR playbook for all the threats that are out there that you're most concerned about. Now, you might only start with a few scenarios. So don't get panicked if you think, okay, we only have one or two scenarios. That's fine. But the playbook should grow over time. As threats grow, as you get more mature, as you continue to test and plan and things like that, you probably are going to have additional scenarios down the road. So don't be afraid to start small. Business email compromise, ransomware, those are two really popular ones. Just kind of start with those scenarios and move on from there. But the IR playbook is going to be important because when we do have to put our incident response plan in place, if we've already tested on that scenario or that threat, we already have something we can use. We have a playbook, right? We don't have to worry about where are we starting? What are we going to do? We've already done that work. All right, procedures for inappropriate use you want to have as part of your incident response plan. This is pretty simple, but if there is an employee or somebody that violates our acceptable usage policies, obviously that can create an incident. So that might be something we want to consider and have procedures for. We want to have definitions for personally identifiable information. Now, the important thing there is that that definition can vary from jurisdiction to jurisdiction and state to state. So you are going to want to know your definition. If it were up to me, I would have just posted, hey, this is the definition of it. But it does really depend on where you are, first of all, but it also kind of really depends on not just what state you are operating in, but also where your customers reside as well. So what is the definition of personally identifiable information? And you'd want to know your definition and have it written down. You also want to have procedures for customer notification. So notification for requirements for customers also vary state by state. That includes things like data classification. So what needs to be notified on? What are the time frames? Who do we need to notify? Those are all things that are going to vary state by state at this point. And you need to know your requirements and have them written down again so that we can make sure in the event of some sort of incident, we're prepared to respond. Now, again, if you do grab the slide deck from the handouts or if you request them from me directly, I went ahead and hyperlinked to 2 sites here that can really help you get those definitions. But again, it's going to be something you want to know, not just for the state you operate out of, but for any state that you might have customers in as well. We want to have contact information, and this probably is pretty intuitive, right? We want to have the contact information at the ready for our employees, for our incident response team members, for our vendors that we would need to have, any service providers, law enforcement, bank regulators, insurance companies. The last thing you want to be doing is going to Google or, God forbid, a phone book and trying to figure out, hey, what's Sally's number again? Or how do we reach out to this vendor that we need? We need to have our digital forensics team come in. Does anybody remember what the phone number was? Have all of this stuff ready so that in the event of having to implement your plan, you have it at your fingertips and you're good to go. You also want to include testing requirements. So how often are you testing? What types of tests are you running? Who's required to attend? What are we documenting? You want to make sure that you're laying all this out so that you're prepared to be able to show anybody, hey, this is what we're doing. This is how we are testing our program. This is how often we're doing it, and all those good sorts of things. Now, one question that may come up is how often are we supposed to? Guidance tells us you should be doing it annually at minimum. Our recommendation is a little bit more strenuous than that. We do recommend that you do it more like quarterly. It doesn't mean you have to do 5 scenarios every single quarter, but pick and choose and start thinking about what do we want to look at? What scenario do we want to talk about this quarter, or whatever the case may be. Now, if you're doing it annually and that's you're happy with that, that's fine. But we do recommend that you perform that testing a little bit more frequently than that. And then the last piece we talked about is integration. So your incident response plan shouldn't be siloed. We are big at our company. If you've heard me talk at all, we don't believe that your information security program should be siloed. So you want to incorporate it as part of your risk management program overall. But most importantly, it really should mesh with your business continuity plan and your vendor management for the reasons we talked about earlier. And just to recap those, the idea there is an incident, while it seems like an incident response sort of situation, probably is going to, or in some cases anyway, will have some impact on our business continuity or our disaster recovery, right? Are we going to be down for some period of time? How are we going to handle that? What are our procedures for getting back up and running? So you want to make sure those things are integrated. And then your vendor management is a big piece because, frankly, a lot of the stuff we're doing nowadays are outsourced. We want to make sure we know the vendors we need to be working with. And then if there are incidents at a vendor, we want to make sure we are understanding that risk as well. So again, don't just think of this as we have an incident response plan, but it doesn't touch anything else. It really should be, if you're doing it correctly, integrated kind of throughout your risk management program overall. All right, so now that we know what we need to have in an incident response program, and again, I should go back really quickly. So that was kind of the core concepts. There's obviously other things that you may have in there. How you acquire your threat intelligence. You may want to lay that out. You may want to talk about your key risk indicators. which is basically how do we know what normal is, so we can determine if something's not normal. That's something that you might want to consider including. You could include something like the cyber kill chain that we talked about. So there are lots of things that you can have as part of your incident response program, but the things that are planned, the things that we talked about are kind of those core components. So how do you know when to use it and how do you use it? So again, we know what's in there. How do we know when we need to and how do we use it? So the first thing is, what are our triggering events? What are the events that could potentially occur that could cause us to have to go to our incident response plan? Now, you probably have a ton more than these, but just quickly, any system malfunctions. If something's not working the way it's supposed to, it prompts you to think about, there might be something wrong, that could be something that would trigger you to use your incident response plan. If you get a call from an employee or a user about unusual behavior, something's happening on my PC, I'm getting pop-ups or something like that, that's something. Or maybe they just call you and say, hey, I clicked on a link in an email and I think that's a problem. So you want to have, that could be a triggering event. A notification from a system administrator about unusual behavior, notification from detection devices, or system log reviews that have unusual activities. Again, what's our normal? And if things aren't normal, we might want to enact our plan. Discrepancies within key risk indicators, and then a loss of connectivity. So again, this is not an exhaustive list of all of the things that you should consider as a triggering event for your incident response plan, but they are some pretty good examples that you might want to consider. How do you use it? It's pretty simple. You use your playbook, right? We've already done this. If we've followed the steps that we've outlined here, we probably have a playbook ready for us to use in the event of some sort of threat that happens. So if there's a phishing email or a business email compromise or ransomware or something like that, and we've already got the steps, the step-by-step walkthrough, we just use our playbook. We've tested it. We understand that it works. We understand how it works. We've addressed any gaps. So again, it's pretty easy to say, but that's what you're going to do. If I have to use my incident response plan, we use it. We put it in place specifically for this purpose. And a good example, let's just kind of take a sample. I'm going to use phishing as an example here. So the protect step in phishing, we talk about things like security awareness training and testing. So do we have that in place? Are we testing our users regularly? Are we making sure that they're aware and have security top of mind? Do we have things like domain keys identified, sender policy framework, domain-based message authentication reporting and conformance? Those are all services you can use that really help you understand the authenticity rather of an email. It also helps you understand if the email sender is legitimate and things like that. Are we doing email sandboxing? So can we make sure that if an email comes in with a link, we can test it in an environment where it's not going to impact us? And then are we using multi-factor authentication as necessary? So again, we have the plan, it's phishing. These are the protect steps that we've got in place. How do we detect phishing? Are there unexpected emails from known or unknown individuals, that we're getting? Do those emails contain links and or attachments? Are the links, when we hover over them, taking us to places that we aren't where they say they're going to? Are those emails prompting extreme feelings? Are we getting, is it telling us we have to do something or we need to do this or else or something like that? We all know, kind of what is out there that prompts us to understand, hey, this might be a phishing email, but that's kind of that detecting step. And then finally, the responding, quarantine it. Take it out of everybody's inbox so we don't have to worry about, just because Brett didn't click on it doesn't mean Nick's not going to click on it. Our SIM, if we have a SIM system, do we need to update any rules? And then, what are the indicators of compromise? Is everything normal? Do we have to worry about our key risk indicators? Are we seeing traffic that we shouldn't be seeing? Again, how are we responding to that? And then recovery is basically getting back to normal as well. So again, if you have a good plan in place and you've gone through it, you have those playbooks for the different scenarios, if you've tested it, if you're doing the things you're supposed to do, when there is an incident, you are ready to handle it. It's the idea of failing well, right? I talked about up front, focusing on protection is not enough because, I don't necessarily believe this adage, but the adage is it's not if, it's when you're going to have some sort of incident like this. I, again, don't 100% believe that, but it's pretty sound logic, right? There's every 39 seconds, there's a cyber attack that occurs. So chances are good, you're gonna have to deal with some incident someday. And if we have this plan in place, we're not doing it on the fly. We have steps, we have a tested program that we can use. All right, so just some takeaways on kind of the incident response overall before we get into some of the things that SBS can do and talk a little bit more about the retainer. If an unauthorized party was in my network, how would I know? And if someone was sending information out the back door, how would I be able to tell? If you can't answer both of those questions effectively, you're gonna have some work to do. So just think about those two in particular. You need to understand the cycle of incident response, right? So identify, prevent, detect, respond, and recover, and know the controls you have in place to mitigate those risks at each level. So again, you don't have to use the cyber kill chain as an example if you don't want to, but that is an effective way to look at it and think, okay, what controls do we have in place at each step to try to mitigate this risk? And where are our gaps? You need to build a strong incident response plan. You need to test it regularly, and you need to update as needed. Again, this is not something that can just be, hey, we created that incident response plan 5 years ago. We're okay with it. We don't really do anything. It sits in a desk drawer somewhere. That's not it's not an effective plan. It might be a plan that maybe you can get by an examiner or something like that. Probably not. But again, it's something that needs to be refined. It needs to be tested. We need to add to it. The changes alone in the different types of threats that are out there, the different vectors of those threats, we need to be aware of that. And we need to build this out on a more continual basis. All right, so how can SBS help? Now, again, if you've grabbed the handouts, or again, if you request them from me, I just do want to point out that we've kind of got a variety of different ways we can assist you. In terms of some testing, we do offer network security testing, vulnerability assessments, penetration tests, social engineering. But if you want to take a step further, if you want to kind of get more ambitious with your testing, we might recommend something like a red team test. So let's go back. A VA, a vulnerability assessment, is a scan, right? We're scanning our network to see if there's any vulnerabilities, and we're going to get a report that tells us whether or not there are. A penetration test takes it a step further. We scan, but we also try to exploit. A red team test would be more of a real life scenario. We're going to basically treat it as though we are an attacker, and we're going to try to simulate an attack on your network. And that's going to probably give you a more real life understanding of how effective a job your controls are putting in, how effective the controls you put in place rather are doing at mitigating risk. If you want to go even further, there's also purple team testing. So for those of you who are not familiar with that concept, red team is the attacker, blue team is the people at your institution or organization that are protecting against the attacker, and then a purple team test would involve both of them. So the red team is trying to get in, the blue team is trying to prevent them from doing it, and then there's somebody that's watching the blue team at the same time and making sure they're following their steps and that they're adequate and they're doing the right things. So again, network security testing can be as simple as a vulnerability assessment or a penetration test, which is also very effective, all the way up to something more ambitious like a red team or a purple team test. We do offer incident response planning. So if you want to get help from a consulting perspective in building out your plan or testing your plan, we do tabletop scenario testing. Anything like that, we can help you build out your incident response plan as well. One of the newer offerings, we actually rolled this out on a cyber showcase a few months ago, is an incident readiness assessment. So this is it's not an IT audit. We sometimes get people saying, hey, well, how's that different than our IT audit? This focuses much more on the incident readiness side of things, the incident response side of things. So I would encourage you to read up on that if you're interested, but basically it's going to give you a really good feel for how ready are we for some sort of incident that may occur. We also have a certified banker incident handler certification, which is a bit of a mouthful, but if you want to get certified in incident handling, we have a certification program that you can register for as well. We also have a ton of free resources, and I hyperlink these as well. We've got a top 5 most common incident response scenarios blog post that will walk you through kind of the prevent, detect, respond, recover for the top 5 most common incident response scenarios we see. We've got 7 steps to build an incident response playbook. It's going to get into way more detail than I did about what your playbook should look like. 8 emergency preparedness testing scenarios. So you're having trouble coming up with your own scenarios, you can use that. We've got a checklist that has 50 plus items you might want to consider when it comes to incident response. So that's pretty broad. Indicators of compromise blog. And then finally, and I found this one really interesting, how the cyber kill chain can help protect you against attacks. So those are all articles that I would encourage you to take a look at if you need to beef up your plan, or if you're just curious about what might be out there to help you moving forward. So those are the things that we're currently offering or have offered in the past. I am excited to introduce what we're calling the Arctic Wolf IR JumpStart Retainer. So this is a new retainer for incident response that we are offering in conjunction with our partner Arctic Wolf. The benefits of a retainer are pretty simple, and many of you may have one already, but the benefits of it, you have somebody to call. You're not having to worry about, okay, we had an incident, now who are we going to talk to? What are we going to do? Who do we talk to? Who do we call? We're eliminating that. We've got somebody. We know who we need to work with. Rapid engagement. In the case of this JumpStart retainer, they offer a 1-hour response time. So something happens, you're getting a response within an hour. Fast track scoping call based on IR plan. So if you have a plan, they can scope that call, any engagement potentially out, and fast track that as necessary. You get discounted pricing on any service engagement. So if they do need to provide any service, the retainer allows for discounted pricing on those hours. And then they do provide recommendations for legal and other resources during response. So rapid engagement's another piece. And then finally, a full service IR team. So from containment to restoration, and then offering in-depth digital forensics analysis as well. So lots of great benefits to that retainer. In Arctic Wolf, just as part of the retainer, they look at the idea of this in terms of 3 different pieces. Security, so they're going to secure your environment by eliminating threat actor access. They're going to analyze the cause and extent of the activities while they were inside the network, and then they are going to restore the organization to its pre-incident condition. So that's the framework that they're going to follow. Now, one of the questions I'm sure that will come up, or you're probably forming in your head already, is what does this cost? Right now, and the pricing is subject to change, the retainer itself is $5,000 annually. So if you are interested in this, that is the cost. That would allow you to have access to all the benefits we talked about earlier. And just so you know, that annual cost will include that 1-hour SLA response time. It includes that no-cost scoping call. So if there is an incident, there's a no-cost scoping call included. They do give you access to an IR plan builder, so that can help you build out your incident response plan. I will tell you, it's probably not quite as in depth as we typically see in the financial services industry. So while it might be helpful, there might be some additional work you have to do there, but they do provide access to a builder. An IR plan review session with a dedicated incident response director. So you will have a dedicated incident response detector dedicated to your account. Discounted hourly rate for any necessary engagements. So if you called Arctic Wolf and said, hey, we had an incident, but we don't have the retainer, it's X amount. By having the retainer in place, you get a discounted hourly rate. So again, lots of great benefits, but the real big one here is we know who we're going to talk to. We don't have to worry about trying to figure that out on the fly, because as we've talked about a number of times already, that's the worst scenario. That's the worst case scenario. Something happened and we're just flying by the seat of our pants. We want to be as prepared as we possibly can, and this retainer is a great opportunity for you to be able to do that. Excuse me. I made it all the way through and had to cough at the end here. So with that said, excuse me, here is my contact information. I'm going to check and see if any questions came in here in just a second. But if you have any questions, please do feel free to contact me directly. So I was so close there. Almost made it through entirely. If you, the only question I saw come in that I'll address here, excuse me, The other one I'll address offline, but if you want to get a copy of the documents here, there should be a handout section in your GoToMeeting toolbar. You should be able to download it right from there. Excuse me. Alternatively, please feel free to contact me. I'll be happy to send a recording of this session, as well as the documents as well. So with that said, and I really apologize for having a coughing fit at the end here, but really appreciate your time today. Hopefully this was helpful and informative. If you want to get any more information about anything we can do to help or how we can help you with your plan, please do feel free to let us know. So with that said, thank you so much. Really appreciate your time. Looks like you'll get a few minutes back of your life here. But if there's anything we can do, let us know. And happy Cybersecurity Awareness Month going forward here. So thanks again.